So now is the opportunity to open it up for discussion. And I do want to start, I thought Alex made a very useful comment as he ended the last session. He pointed out the tensions that have come up in our discussion. And, my observation, tensions can be useful. Sometimes a tension is something that moves you forward. You're going to resolve that tension in a way that you move forward. Other times, tensions just lead us into arguing with each other and not finding common agreement. And I don't know that I captured all of his tensions, but between the nutrient focus and the dietary focus, the genetic focus, the sort of phenotypic focus, individuals, populations, that final health outcome, biomarkers in the pathway. And I think we just added one of that tension between acute and chronic and how we think about that. So I'm just curious about when you think about those tensions, how you all are thinking they help us move forward or get us in the argument mode.
Well, I think a lot of that's up to us and what we do with it. I think we have the opportunity for it to help us move forward. But I know many of us are very realistic about this. And I mean, we could come up with things, we really need to do this and this. And then we do feel constrained by lack of money if it needs to be research driven, by how might we more effectively interact with regulatory agencies. I think one of the things but if we come back to the clinical part, we want to have, if you will, the authority somebody saying, yes, this looks like it is effective, and it's just not me and what I believe, or it's because my research, or it's because it's my favorite disease. So I think the tension we have to parlay into what are we going to do next? What can the National Academies do? If you look at our sponsors, we have the NIH here, we have the FDA here, hopefully this has been inspiring there. If we fall back to, which we certainly can do, is like arguing the fouling points, I think we lose our momentum. But I'm among the first to say that, much of what we talk about nutrition doing simply, one, probably isn't true, but we need the evidence. We need something, because this is medicine, and if you're gonna put it in the clinical domain versus population, personal choice, supplements are unregulated, so we got the whole spectrum here.
In terms of the tensions, I think a lot of the time it comes from not everyone having a clear understanding of what question is being asked. So just, any time spent to clarify the question, what are we actually trying to get at here, I think would go a long way towards not eliminating the tension, but at least getting people to a perspective where they could approach it with a clear understanding of what the issues are.
I think one of the tensions is what I said yesterday morning, what is a nutrient? And how do we define that whole process? Because really that's the bioactive substances in our body and the tissues that they work at, is much broader than what we've sometimes thought of as just 29 vitamins and minerals and amino acids or something. So I think we have a lot of opportunity there. I think that rather than call it tension, I think it's opportunity to clarify and to acknowledge value that perhaps hasn't always been there.
Denise Ney, University of Wisconsin-Madison. I had a comment on the tension, and I would characterize the tension as the scientific approach, we do not have enough evidence, and the clinician approach, that we have to tell them something, about diet. This is our role of clinicians, and we do have some evidence. And I just want to, when we consider the tension, want to introduce the concept of do no harm and let's be careful how we sort out the tension. And I'll give you an example of that from the PKU world. And that is that it was decided that it was okay to discontinue the PKU diet. There was evidence, there was a study in the New England Journal of Medicine, and that was not a good thing. It was decided that at 12 years of age, the brain was around that, the brain was developed. Now you can eat a normal diet. And I've talked with people with PKU that said that, yeah, they can remember that now their mom said you got to drink the milk, you know. And this had very negative consequences. And we had to have Dick Cook, the PKU collaborative study to show that the IQs went down, the attainment, everything. Okay. So just to comment, we've got the tension, but please, let's have a risk-benefit assessment, which is in the DRIs, and let's do no harm.
Having now spent almost half of my career as a scientist developing specialized food formulations for the management of chronic diseases and conditions, the last 15 years I've struggled with this concept of distinctive nutritional requirement for these food formulations. And I say food formulation because that takes into account the tensions of what's a nutrient, what's a bioactive substance, and how we define all this. What constitutes proof for a DNR? Is it a well-constructed clinical study? Is it accumulation of evidence in open label observational studies, case series in combination with small RCTs? Is it knowing the mechanism of these compounds at the molecular level and their effect on tissues in addition to the clinical evidence? And then at what point do you tip over into the drug world? And so at this point, the quandary that I'm still struggling with is this definition. There has to be a space for nutritional therapy to help patients, and safe nutritional therapies, to get to Denise's point. GRAS substances, specially formulated for the management of chronic condition disease under medical supervision. This seems like a very good goal for patients. Patients are asking for it. Clinicians are asking for it. We're asking for it, but we need a structure in which to work in. And so that's our quandary today, is having a structure within to develop these needed therapeutics that may ultimately, to Tim's point, reduce costs of care. And so I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on our ultimate question today. How do you establish a DNR?
Well, I would back it off a little bit. I think we do, as you ran through the list of potential quality of evidence, I think if you're talking about a product for humans, and you are, that the emphasis for me really is, like you said, it can start off small and observational or case, all of that, but as long as it ends up with a little bit of randomized clinical trial, small samples, or again, novel designs, I would certainly be interested in considering that. I don't think that will rise to the level in the near future of changing DRIs or these kind of things, but I think part of what you're bringing up is the regulatory process. Probably, with medical foods, companies can go forward with whatever they want with virtually no evidence and come to market, and about the only time it gets into the FDA space is if there's a problem. Now, most really forward-thinking ethical companies want to do some research because it's also good things to tell your patients. So I think, there really is a place for that. But I do, and again, my whole career is in nutrition, and I do feel strongly that I need evidence, I need demonstration that something works. I'm old enough that I've gone through all sorts of things where, I'm a pediatrician, children with chronic diseases with desperate parents have turned to nutrition for things, and with hope and money that in the end didn't work out. I'd like to avoid as much if I can going forward, but I'm all open for innovation. And sort of like our chair said, I'm also enough of a clinician that I'm intrigued by what the mechanism is. But I really I'm less interested in the animal studies. I know that's how many good ideas rise, because we've got good examples of it worked in the animals and it didn't work in the humans. But I think you're actually in a stronger space than you might think, and innovations are coming.
I guess if I could maybe address that from a more probably narrow perspective, but from a distinct nutrient requirement, let's say from a DRI, I think probably what part of it is whether the requirement falls outside the normal distribution. And in setting DRIs, there has been consideration of groups that might have distinct nutrient requirements. So vitamin C, for example, for smokers, we make a separate recommendation because their needs are greater. For vegetarians, we make a different recommendation for iron because of reduced bioavailability. And in those cases, it's that the need of that subpopulation is falling outside the normal distribution. Now, I know that's a really narrow definition, but for a nutrient, as opposed to a whole medical food that has a whole package, that might be one way to consider it.
I would one reason the committee wanted to focus on special nutrient requirements, to use that terminology, I think it allowed us to tackle this whole area in a broader way, to think about the whole spectrum that we're thinking about. And again, one of the things that has struck me in this workshop is where we started with the inborn errors of metabolism, where it was clear there was a special nutrient requirement. We could look at it and say, we've got to do something in this case. But as our science has advanced and as our understanding of disease has advanced because of better genetic tools, metabolic tools, now we're suddenly in this area where we have to rethink, is an inborn error of metabolism the only place where there's a special nutrient requirement? Or do we need to really think, how do we define it for these other areas? And obviously we're not answering that question in the workshop, but I think we put on the table things that have to go into our thinking about where are we going to go with that future. Is Kristen part of I don't know if she wanted.
While we're bringing her, I would just to go back to the question, I don't think it's nutrients, I think, should, as you were saying, stay defined in that setting. But I think at this point, the other bioactive compounds are definitely on the table. They're just not going to have DRIs. So I don't see that, other than just taking a breath and saying these are important parts of our dietary patterns and may have health benefits. But being classified as an essential nutrient is not being classified isn't a block to the other work.
Thanks for a wonderful panel. Just a couple of questions, mostly definitions. It seems to me that it's important going forward to really carefully define what's meant by primary, secondary, tertiary prevention and disease treatment, because to me, it's really more where you were trained. If you're in public health, every disease treatment seems to be tertiary prevention or secondary. And so that's something that I think is clogging up thinking. And the second thing is the whole notion of upper levels and some of the problems that I think the original committee had in defining statistical methods for handling the upper levels. And as we go forward, I think the important thing is to define them, just as Dr. Barr mentioned, defining functional indicators being different. It solves a lot of the problems that people are concerned about.
Hi, Jenna Rostifer, Abbott Nutrition. Thanks to the panel for very eloquently summarizing a very productive dialogue the past day and a half. My question is whether perhaps we're putting too much literal emphasis on the term special or the term distinctive as it pertains to nutritional requirement. We looked at a lot of overviews showing the distribution of the DRI. And I do think there are situations where you have a disease patient who has a need within that DRI range, but perhaps on a more narrow range of tolerance. So thinking through the clinical application of this for a patient, is it more important that we're controlling that delivery of the nutrient within that range? Is that in itself a special nutritional requirement, even if it's within that range? Or perhaps another example is if this special nutritional requirement results from a non-nutrient need, from a physical need like the need for a tube feeding, where it becomes very important to deliver a very controlled level of those nutrients because you're providing the sole source of nutrition. So just trying to think of, are there other ways of defining that phrase special or distinct that doesn't necessarily mean a shift in the DRI curve?
I think those are great questions. So for the one, the one about you're within the bell-shaped curve and you need more narrow nutrient delivery, I think that, one, I don't think that has to have anything to do with the DRIs. I think that really goes back to understanding, hopefully, personalized medicine and better understanding of delivery. But I do believe that's clinically important. And I embedded in what I think you were saying, the terms are a little bit left over from the regulatory phase. So again, we don't have to be confined by all of that going forward. In the WIC program, we were always happy that there was the fifth basket, children with special nutritional needs, which is how we got things like the formula for PKU and things like that. And even in the DRI language. So I wouldn't be, I don't think those terms are really important. The term that's going to be really important in the regulatory, in the DRI process, I think is the idea of what is a chronic disease, because we now have the mandate to make DRIs that consider chronic disease. We just haven't had a successful effort, but I hope 20 years from now, there'll be a whole list of chronic diseases for which we've moved through that. But other thoughts?
Well, I'll just agree with Jenna that I think, I guess I go back to what I said before, that what's distinctive is the need of a patient in a particular situation, and that may justify a more narrow tolerance than a normal somebody else, and somebody with one disease or one phase of a disease may have a different requirement than someone in a later phase of the disease. So there's so many factors, and you get into just generalized malnutrition in hospitalized patients. That's a whole category in its own self, the sarcopenia and everything else. So I think it's part of the ongoing discussion.
I would just add, I think it's important to put that question on the table, because to me it begs the question of, are we functioning in the right framework now, or do we really need to rethink our framework for how we're handling individuals with disease where nutrition becomes a factor in the management of that disease? And, we've had a framework that has served us well, and going forward, especially now that we're really looking at the issue directly and we're bringing chronic disease into how we think about DRIs, asking the question of nutrient requirement for what, given where we are now, I think it is fair to say, do we have the right framework in place and we just need to get these definitions better and more agreement on the definitions, or do we need to rethink the framework?
And I think that leads on as well to the distinction between a recommendation for a group versus dealing with a specific individual. Because, ideally the situation where somebody's tolerance to a nutrient is very low, that requires individual monitoring of that person as well as the means to assess that. So, if we have someone who only tolerates a very limited range of protein, then that means we have to have some regular monitoring of that person as well as a sensitive specific tool to do that. And that is going to be distinct to that individual. It's not going to be something that can be generalized to other people with that same condition because they'll differ.
But just to echo, I think the idea that the framework that we've been working with since the 40s or 50s may not be fully suitable now. Mm-hmm. I agree absolutely. That's part of what needs to be considered, and that's part of what this is starting.
Hi, this is Deborah Demuth with Barr Pharmaceuticals Consumer Health. Comment and a question. The comment goes back to, we're talking about how to organize a framework, whatever. I just want to remind everyone of a basic principle in business, and that is that the structure of your organization or your framework needs to follow the functions. So first you define what the functions are, and then you go back and decide what's the best structure to create that good working function. And so I think that's part of the argument here is let's focus on what we're trying to accomplish and then determine what the best structure is going to be in order to do that. But my question goes back to, obviously I'm in pharmaceuticals, support consumer health division. My biggest question is how can we give legitimacy to these bioactives, to these phytonutrients, to these compounds that are in almost every research paper when you look at digestive diseases, digestive health also. It's sorely lacking. What are they? And are they actually a part of medical foods? I know we're not talking about regulations for medical foods, but I do want to emphasize that we really need to come to terms with what is a nutrient. Can we expand that definition so that we can have more incentive to create some of these products that we know, based on science, can be effective, particularly in the digestive health area?
And my personal bias we would continue to call what we think of in nutrition as essential nutrients, and the macronutrient group that. And that we have another term that we raise up and we respect as something that might well contribute to human health. And those are all of those other things. I don't personally see the need. We've got our vitamins and our minerals to add things to that list, but to create a list that will, in the end, be much, much longer than whatever we have, 26 nutrients that we keep track of. So I don't see it as a tension. I think in many ways, and many of over the last 20 years, it's recognized something's going on there. Whether you call them nutrients, or you call them other food components, or all sorts of other words that'll probably be better from a consumer point of view, that have health benefits. But I don't know the right name.
Yeah. So this is it's a very relevant point because you can't talk about them other than structure function claims unless you're a medical food. Medical food is the only food component that allows you to link a disease with that nutrition. No other food. So it's the communication. You make a product, but you can't tell anybody what it's for because that's a drug claim if it actually helps the disease. So, that's, again, we're not here to talk regulatory, but without a full appreciation of the regulatory challenges that industry faces, I think sometimes our solutions become a little bit oversimplistic.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Nadia Casey with the Healthcare Nutrition Council. I have two questions and just a brief comment. So my first question is your thoughts about recommendations to think about integrating health outcomes into a scientific approach. What are your recommendations about that, how to do that?
I have to remind you, we're not here to make recommendations.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so I would invite the panel to give their personal
Sure,
opinion
yes.
about that question.
Idea of health outcomes, again, it needs definitions, but I think one of the things we are doing now better is adding the patient-reported outcomes kind of information and the quality of life kind of, and those, in the strictest sense, probably aren't going to rise to the level of biomarkers or surrogate biomarkers in many places, but I do think that information is now routinely being collected and is being published in traditional journals, and clinicians and everybody else are interested in that. So there is a bit of that captured, those, if you will, those things that you never would have seen in New England Journal articles 10 years ago, or showing up with, at least in CF, when we had CFTR modulations, breakthrough therapy, and lung function, but there was also quality of life. So there is some change in that.
I don't know if can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. If somebody could, yeah, okay. Now when we're talking about developing clinical practice guidelines, we're not looking at outcomes, what we'd call maybe a surrogate outcome. And I'll use an example of from COPD because that's one I'm a little bit familiar with. When you're doing a systematic review and you're looking at the research, you might see a lot of FEV1, sort of lung function type outcomes. And when you go to a guideline panel, they don't want to see that in terms of the end point. They want to see the patient-centered outcome. Is that person's quality of life getting improved? And so, now more studies are focusing on looking at those patient-centered outcomes, and it's part of the framework of developing a guideline.
Yeah, I would just add that I think we heard that with the advent of more electronic monitoring devices, all kinds of connectivity that we're having, the ability to track outcomes of various kinds, whether it's blood glucose or activity level or sleep quality, things of that nature, are now being able to be collected much more regularly, and so you can start to draw some correlations between what your intervention is and how the patient actually is doing.
Right. I do think sometimes the technology gets ahead of the science in that regard. We are at the ending time for this, so if you have a quick question, and Denise, if you have a quick question, we'll take those, and then we want to move to hear the sponsors.
Yeah, I guess I just have a comment because we've had a lot of discussion, and we say, we understand that there's a lot of unanswered questions, right? And certainly we were talking about like the definition for DNR, and it's been like 30 years, and we haven't been able to get to that place. I was a little disappointed to hear the presentation from the gentleman representing the DOD, right? Thinking about all these years and all this amount of money, and we haven't really gotten to a place where we can impact, right, the person, the patient. And so I just wanted to just make a note just to say that, science, right, we can't do it alone, so we need industry and we need patient groups to be involved at the table, but also to challenge us to move the conversation forward from here, just to see this as a starting place. And it is a public health emergency, right? I would just say this, and then I'll close my comment. My father was a Vietnam era veteran who had traumatic brain injury, who was also addicted to heroin and was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at the age of 24. The VA decided to put him in a residential senior living center at the age of 27 and move him to Lyons Hospital, which is an acute care hospital in New Jersey, where he was for 15 years. And so when I think about this, right, which is why I'm here in the work, I just want to say that there are really people, right? So I come from a consumer perspective, but there are people at the other end of this spectrum. And so I know we can't talk about regulation, and I know that FDA is in the room, but what I will say is it's time, right? We have to move this forward. So I just close with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very quick, a question for Susan Barr. Can the DRI category of adequate intake help us with this dilemma of limited evidence base.
Oh dear. You can just say yes or no. I actually could say yes or no, because the AI has been such a nightmare in terms of doing anything with it.
Yeah, the AI has been a real challenge. I shouldn't say a nightmare in terms of.
That wasn't recorded.
Well,
Your mic was off.
okay, yeah. In terms of how you act on that, because what does it actually mean? You can't look at, are people actually getting enough if they are above, below the AI. I think something like an AI could be tweaked, perhaps, in terms of an intake that might be helpful. But I think you could do some things, but you wouldn't want to call it an AI because of the. Well, not It was an iteration when we couldn't have an EAR, an RDA. So yeah, good idea.
Great. So I'm going to thank the panel, and we're going to move to our last session.